not from a place of revenge or satisfaction, but from a place of deep psychological truth. Because when you finally close that door permanently, when you block them, when you refuse to respond, when you build boundaries they cannot penetrate, something shifts in their internal world that is almost pathological in its intensity. You have become what we call, in psychological terms, a narcissistic injury. But not just any injury. You've become their greatest one. And here's what that really means. Every time they think of you now, you are not a person they miss or love, or even particularly remember with any genuine emotion. No, you are a mirror that reflects back to them their most terrifying truth, that they failed, that they lost control, that despite all their charm, their manipulation, their calculated moves, you slipped through their fingers and you're not coming back. This is intolerable to the narcissistic mind. You have to understand, the narcissist constructs their entire identity on a foundation of grandiosity, of being special, of being the one who controls the narrative, who discards others, who leaves when they choose to leave. Eternally of the country Elagafa, where all the magnificent but fragile palace, built on sand, and every person they control, every relationship they dominate, is another pillar supporting that structure. When you leave permanently, when you refuse to be hoovered back, you don't just remove a pillar, you become a wrecking ball to their entire constructed reality. And so they obsess. But let me be very clear about what this obsession is. It is not love. It is not longing in any human sense that you or I would recognize. It is the obsession of someone who has lost a game they believed they were destined to win. You are the wound that will not heal, because healing would require them to acknowledge something their psyche simply cannot tolerate, that they were not enough, that their tactics failed, that you saw through them and chose yourself over them. This is why, paradoxically, the person who successfully escapes a narcissist often remains more present in the narcissist's mind than those who stayed, than those who continue to provide supply. The ones who stay confirm the narcissist's worldview. But you shattered it. And that shattering reverberates through everything they do going forward. You become the ghost that haunts their grandiosity, the question mark that undermines their certainty, the one who got away not because they were magnanimous enough to let you go, but because you were strong enough to leave. What they think about you then is not really about you at all. It's about them. It's about their ego's desperate attempt to metabolize a reality it cannot accept. They think about you the way someone thinks about a puzzle they couldn't solve, a battle they couldn't win, a narrative they couldn't control. And in that thinking, there is no empathy, no genuine reflection, no real human connection, only the cold calculation of a wounded ego trying to restore itself. The greatest power you hold is not in what they think of you, but in your refusal to let their thoughts define your reality. Because in the end, you are not their injury to carry. You are your own person to become. Now, let's talk about what happens in the narcissist's mind when they realize that their entire playbook, every manipulation tactic they've refined over years, every emotional button they learned to push, every guilt trip, every promise, every threat has suddenly become powerless. Because this is where the rage really lives. This is where their thoughts about you turn particularly venomous. You see, the narcissist operates through a very specific internal logic. They believe, at a core level, that they have a kind of master key to human psychology. Their lives studying people, not with empathy, but with the cold calculation of someone learning to pick locks. They know that if they apologize in just the right way, you'll soften. They know that if they threaten abandonment, you'll chase. They know that if they play the victim convincingly enough, you'll rescue them. This isn't love or connection. This is mechanics. They've turned human relationship into a predictable equation, and for most of their lives, that equation has worked. But then something shifts. You go no contact. Inning day, you block their number. You stop responding to the emails that used to make your heart race with anxiety. You no longer react when they show up unannounced or reach out through mutual friends. And for the first time in their experience with you, the equation fails. The lock doesn't turn. The button they push produces no response. You have become immune. And this immunity, this is what enrages them beyond measure. Because understand, the narcissist's sense of power doesn't come from being loved. It comes from being effective. It comes from knowing that they can create an emotional response in you, that they can make you dance, that they can pull your strings whenever they choose. Material of the idea today, your immunity isn't just a personal rejection. It's an existential threat to their entire self-concept as someone who understands and controls human behavior. In their mind, you've done something that violates the fundamental rules of their universe. You've refused to play the game. And to the narcissist, this makes you dangerous. Not dangerous in any real sense, but dangerous to the carefully constructed illusion they need to survive. They think of you now as the opponent who somehow figured out their strategy, who stopped following the script, who looked behind the curtain and decided the wizard wasn't impressive at all. This is why they often become obsessed with finding new ways to reach you, new tactics to try, new mutual friends to manipulate. It's not because they miss you. It's because they cannot tolerate the idea that someone exists who is no longer susceptible to their influence. In their internal narrative, you've become the one who won by the simple act of refusing to continue playing. And for someone whose entire identity rests on winning, on controlling, on being the one who decides when things end, this is unforgivable. What they feel toward you is not the rage of a lover scorned. It's the rage of a chess master who realizes their opponent has simply stood up and walked away from the board. All their strategy, all their carefully planned moves, all their certainty about how the game would unfold, rendered completely meaningless by your willingness to stop participating. They rage not because they've lost you, but because you've demonstrated something they can never admit, that their power was always contingent on your participation. Your indifference is the greatest rebellion against their reign. And in that rebellion, you reclaim what was always yours, your own mind. But here's where it gets truly fascinating from a psychological standpoint, and perhaps most painful for those of you who have experienced this. The narcissist doesn't just move on from you. They actively reconstruct the entire history of your relationship in their mind. And I want you to understand that this isn't simply lying to others. This is something far more profound and disturbing. They are engaged in a process of psychological self-preservation that requires them to gaslight themselves. Think about what I'm saying here. The narcissist cannot hold two contradictory truths simultaneously: that they are special, superior, and blameless, and that they behaved in ways that drove someone away. These two realities cannot coexist in their psyche without causing what we call cognitive dissonance, a psychological discomfort so intense that the mind will do almost anything to resolve it. And the narcissist's mind resolves it by rewriting history itself. In their new narrative, you become the unstable one, the irrational one, the abuser, even. Every moment of your legitimate anger at their mistreatment becomes evidence of your instability. Every boundary you set becomes proof of your cruelty. Every time you ask for basic respect or honesty becomes reframed as your unreasonable demands. They take the entire relationship and run it through a filter that inverts reality. And what emerges is a story in which they were the victim of your dysfunction, your manipulation, your inadequacy. And here's what's so insidious about this process. They genuinely begin to believe it. This isn't conscious deception in the way we typically understand it. The narcissist's false self, that grandiose, perfect image they've constructed, cannot survive contact with the truth of their own behavior. So the psyche does what it must to survive. It reconstructs the past in a way that protects the false self from collapse. You didn't leave because they were abusive. You left because you were damaged. They didn't fail. You were simply incapable of appreciating them. The relationship did. To end because of their cruelty. It ended because of your flaws. This is why if you ever hear what the narcissist says about you after you're gone, it can be so shocking, so disorienting. Tell stories about you that bear no resemblance to reality. They describe a version of you that you don't recognize, and they do it with such conviction that others often believe them, because they believe it themselves. They've has to believe it. The alternative, accepting responsibility, acknowledging their own destructive patterns, facing the reality of who they are beneath the mask, is simply not available to them. It would mean psychological annihilation. So they think of you now through this distorted lens. Every time they tell someone else the revised history of your relationship, they're also telling it to themselves, reinforcing the false narrative, cementing it deeper into their psyche. Time You become the villain in a story they've written to save themselves from the unbearable truth of their own emptiness. And the tragedy is not just what they've done to your reputation, but what they've done to their own capacity for growth, for change, for genuine self-reflection. When someone must rewrite the past to protect their present, they forfeit their future. Turiel, the narcissist's greatest prison is not the one you escaped from. It's the one they're building in their own mind, brick by distorted brick. 10 test. Now I need to share something with you that might be difficult to hear, but it's essential to understanding the narcissist's psychology. When they think about you after you've left and they can never come back, they don't experience your absence the way a healthy person experiences loss. They don't think, I miss who they were as a person. They don't reflect on your laugh, your kindness, your particular way of seeing the world. No, what they experience is closer to what's so. Many one feels when a possession has been stolen from them. You are not a person who made a choice. You are property that escaped. Let me explain what I mean by this, because it goes to the heart of how the narcissistic mind conceptualizes relationships. For most of us, love involves recognizing the other person as a separate, autonomous human being, with their own inner world, their own needs, their own right to choose. There's a philosophical concept called I-thou versus I-it relationships, articulated by Martin Buber. In an I-thou relationship, we encounter the other as a full person. In an I-it relationship, we relate to them as an object, a thing to be used. The narcissist lives almost entirely in the realm of I-it. They cannot sustain genuine I-thou relating because that would require them to decenter themselves, to truly see you as real in the way they experience themselves as real. And this is beyond their psychological capacity. So when you were with them, you were not their partner in any authentic sense. You were their supply, their mirror, their appliance, something that existed to fulfill a function in their internal economy. And when you leave, what they mourn is not you. What they mourn is the function you served. They think about you the way someone thinks about a phone that stopped working, a car that won't start, a tool that broke. There's frustration, yes. There's a sense of loss. But it's not the loss of relationship. It's the loss of utility. How did I lose control of what was mine? How did this object that was supposed to serve me suddenly develop its own will and walk away? This is why the hoovering attempts, when they come, feel so hollow, so transactional, because they are. The narcissist isn't reaching out because they've had some profound realization about your worth as a human being. They're reaching out because they want their appliance back. They want the thing that reflected their greatness, that absorbed their toxicity, that provided them with the emotional supply they need to maintain their false self. When they say, I miss you, what they actually mean is, I miss what you did for me. And here's the painful truth. They will often replace you fairly quickly with someone else who can serve the same function. Because in their mind, you were never irreplaceable as a person. You were replaceable as a role. This is why they can move from relationship to relationship with such apparent ease, why they can seem deeply invested one day and completely indifferent the next. They're not attached to people. They're attached to the narcissistic supply that people provide. Understanding this, truly understanding that you were never seen as fully human by them, is both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it means the relationship you thought you had never really existed. Liberating because it means their loss of you has nothing to do with your worth. To you were never their possession to lose. You were always your own person to reclaim. Now, I want to take you deeper into the narcissist's internal world, because what happens behind the scenes is almost clinical in its coldness. While you might imagine them pining for you, missing the connection you shared, longing for reconciliation, the reality is far more calculated. The narcissist is running a cost-benefit analysis. And you need to understand this because it reveals the transactional nature of how they experience relationships. In their mind, there are two competing forces at war. On one side, there's the narcissistic supply. You provided the attention, the validation, the emotional energy you gave them, the way you made them feel powerful and desired and central to someone's universe. That supply has value to them. 10, you're being rude. They're false self-inflated. the substance they need to maintain the illusion of their own grandiosity. And some part of them recognizes that you provided high-quality supply. You cared deeply. You tried hard. You gave them your authentic self. But on the other side of this internal equation sits something even more precious to the narcissist than supply: their pride, their image, their ego. And here's what you must understand. When all doors are truly closed, when it becomes clear that getting you back would require them to humble themselves, to admit wrongdoing, to genuinely apologize, to show vulnerability, to acknowledge that they need you, the equation shifts decisively. For the narcissist, the cost of wounding their pride becomes greater than the value of the supply you provided. Because you see, there are always other sources of supply. There are always other people they can charm, manipulate, draw into their orbit. But their grandiose self-image, that's irreplaceable. That's the core of their entire psychological structure. To damage that by appearing desperate, by seeming like they need someone who rejected them, by showing up as anything less than superior and in control, this is a price they simply will not pay. So they make a calculation, often quite rapidly once they realize you're truly gone. They decide that you're not worth the ego damage. And this decision gets framed in their mind as their choice, their power move, their moment of discarding you. Even though you left them, even though you were the one who said no more, in their reconstructed narrative, they are now the ones choosing to walk away. They tell themselves, and anyone who will listen, that they could get you back if they wanted to. But they've decided you're not worth the effort. They've decided to let you go. They're being the bigger person by not pursuing you. This is the ultimate inversio. You exercised your power by leaving, and they reclaim a sense of power by pretending or choosing not to pursue. And in this internal bargaining, you transition from being valuable supply to being an acceptable loss. Not because you actually lost value, but because claiming you're not worth it cost them less than admitting they can't have you would cost. What's most telling is how quickly this calculation happens once they realize all avenues back to you are truly closed. There's no prolonged mourning, no genuine grief process, just a rapid recalibration. If I can't have you on my terms, then I'll decide you weren't worth having at all. In the narcissist's economy of ego, pride will always be the currency they're unwilling to spend, even if it means losing everything else. But let me tell you what ultimately happens to you in the narcissist's mind once they've moved through their rage, their rewriting of history, and their wounded ego. You become something perhaps even more dehumanizing than anything that came before. You become data. You become a case study. You exist in their psyche not as a person they once claimed to love, but as a cautionary tale they tell themselves about what went wrong and how to avoid it happening again. This is the final and perhaps most chilling transformation of how they think about you, because at least in their rage, you were significant. At least in their obsession, you mattered in some twisted way. But now you've been reduced to a set of lessons learned, a strategic error to be corrected in their next relationship. They think of you the way a general thinks of a lost battle, not with emotion, but with cold analysis. What were the tactical mistakes? Where did the defenses fail? How can the approach be refined next time? And here's what that analysis sounds like in their internal world. They were too aware. Next time, I'll find someone more naive. Or they had too much support from friends. Next time, I'll isolate my target more effectively from the beginning. Or perhaps they developed too much self-worth. Time, I'll be more consistent with the devaluation phase. You see, they're not reflecting on their own behavior with any genuine remorse or desire to change. They're troubleshooting a process that didn't yield the desired outcome. This is what we need to understand about the narcissist's relationship to other human beings. People are not ends in themselves. People are means to an end. That end being the maintenance of narcissistic supply, the feeding of the insatiable ego, the continued construction of the false self. And when a particular person no longer serves that function, when they escape or refuse to participate, they don't disappear from the narcissist's thoughts entirely. They become a reference point, a benchmark, a measuring stick for evaluating future supply sources. So when the narcissist enters a new relationship, you are there in the background of their calculations, not as someone missed or mourned, but as someone whose mistakes, by which I mean your healthy choices, your boundaries, your self-respect, they are determined not to allow in the next person. They're looking for someone who won't do what you did, someone who won't wake up, someone who won't leave, someone easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to keep trapped in the cycle. And there's something profoundly sad about this, not for you, but for the narcissists themselves. Because this instrumental view of human beings means they never actually connect with anyone. They never grieve authentically. They never learn. They never grow. Each relationship is just another iteration of the same pattern, with slight modifications based on previous failures. They're running the same experiment over and over, changing minor variables, hoping for a different result, which is, of course, one definition of insanity. You are not a person in their narrative anymore. You're a chapter in their manual, a footnote in their ongoing research into how to more effectively extract what they need from human beings without those human beings realizing what's happening. It's clinical. It's cold. It's utterly devoid of anything we would recognize as love or genuine human connection.